Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first online talk of the year, hosted by the Centre for Queer History at Goldsmiths, University of London. My name is Justin Bengry. I direct the Centre for Queer History and convene our MA Queer History. It's really exciting to be back, even if online, this year hosting events. We paused for a few years with the pandemic, when we elected to focus our energies on supporting students in the program and colleagues here at Goldsmiths. And then also we paused the program for a year to recollect and build up momentum again. So we've had a pause, and this year we've been excited to bring events back to you. This is not just our first event of the academic year, it's also the inaugural event launching our Queer History PhD network. So that's going to be a new feature of our work at the Centre for Queer History. For those of you who are interested in the PhD network, we have a QR code here that you can capture or you can save for later. It'll be distributed as well through the email lists. But if you'd like to join the PhD network, if you work in queer history and want to be involved in the community that is starting to form, please feel free to join us with that. I want to thank several people, not least of which Khalil West, who's joining us today from Arizona, so a very international talk. I also want to thank my students and colleagues here at Goldsmiths, and especially Isabel Doms, who has put in so much work last year and this year, helping to coordinate these events, hosting many of them, and just doing an all-around fabulous job. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Khalil West, who is our speaker this evening. Khalil has the distinction of being the first person in the world to walk across the stage to accept an MA in queer history. So it is a delight to welcome him back home to Goldsmiths. Khalil was part of the first cohort, and it is really special to us that we can amplify the voices of our alum and our graduates and the incredible work that they are doing. So quickly, a bit of bio information about Khalil. Khalil R West is a PhD candidate in history at the European University Institute in Florence. He graduated as part of the inaugural MA Queer History cohort at Goldsmiths here at University of London. His current research explores mid to late 20th century queer Black socialities in Newark, New Jersey and Liverpool, UK. His ongoing visual oral history project, I Am For You Can Enjoy, is an Arts Council England funded collaboration with British photographer Ajamu X, which examines labor, agency, and pleasure in the experiences of Black masculine identified sex workers. He is the co-founder of Chew Disco, a Liverpool-based party and multidisciplinary art project, which raised funds for safe houses and advocacy organizations working on behalf of sexual minorities, women and girls in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Iraq, Iran, and Russia. His writing has appeared in Attitude, Out There, and Homoculture, and new work will appear in Unsafe Words, Black Radical Pleasure 2, which is forthcoming in The Black Scholar. As a programmer and curator, he's worked with Homotopia in Manchester, at Homotopia, Manchester Pride Superbia, and Foundation for Art and Creative Technologies, among others. Khalil is a member of the Board of Trustees of Islington Mill Foundation, which is dedicated to queer arts, local history, and heritage-focused community outreach, training, and mentoring in Manchester and Salford. You can see how impressed we are with Khalil's just fantastic range of work, much of which was already started and ongoing when he joined us a number of years ago at Goldsmiths. Khalil's talk today is titled Dark Matter, Black Sociality and Queer Illegibility in Liverpool 8, 1967 to 1997. I will bring Khalil up. Welcome, Khalil.
Hello, and thank you so much. It's just struck me how incredibly obnoxious and wordy my bio actually is. But it's really great to be back here. It's great to be back for this occasion as the inaugural speaker. And I'm super excited to talk about my research today, especially because it's at sort of a critical point where I have to start actually stop having fun doing oral histories and really start working with them in a different way. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking and just sort of like get into it. So in recent years, we've seen the increased scholarly attention given to queering Black and Brown districts that are within cosmopolitan centers and capital cities like London, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. Majority Black districts outside of these centers, especially those that are historically marked as urban dystopias, they remain largely underexplored for researchers who are trying to uncover queer and otherwise sexually and erotically complex subjects and spaces of the past. My ongoing PhD research is impulsed by what I see as this missed opportunity. And this paper focuses on one site in my project, which is Liverpool 8, the district of Liverpool, which is also known as L8 by locals, or Toxteth, or Black Liverpool. Though Liverpool 8 has been a site of, incredible, important research for sonic geographers and musicologists, and also for historians of immigration and Black and interracial sociality in Britain. Queer history and queer historians have largely ignored the district as a potential site of study. And this is seemingly because its archive offers no real legible traces of gay space or gay networks. So with a deep history, a deep acknowledged history of clubbing and nightlife that is overshadowed by the Toxteth riots of 1981, Liverpool 8 has basically become primarily synonymous within the national imaginary with poverty, crime, race problems, and violence. What I hope to do in my research is to focus on L8 as a changing space of complex socio-erotic possibility through rather than against this historical illegibility as a site of queer sociality. It's not only my goal to simply establish a history of gay subjects in the area, that's too easy, but also to establish these presences as part of a more kaleidoscopic image of erotics and social intimacies within the area's nightlife spaces. Sort of metaphorically reimagining the dark matter of space and the universe as the expansiveness of invisible or illegibly queer and sexually fugitive encounters in spaces. I'm concerned primarily with the district's social clubs, bars, dance clubs, and the more informal or unlicensed parties in the 30-year period, which followed the partial decriminalization of homosexual acts between men in 1967, and through the managed decline of Liverpool and the escalating anti-Black violence in the district in the 1970s and 1980s, and the simultaneous increased visibility of gay and lesbian identities and spaces in the white city center. So, okay. When the ad for this talk was published, I included some links to some online content just for context. The first was a 1972 television program that focused on these really violent clashes between local white skinheads and local Black youths on a housing estate in Liverpool 8. The second was an excerpt from an interview with two gay white men who lived in a predominantly gay house in Liverpool 8 in the 1970s. And the third was a video of an interview with three young Black men from Liverpool 8. This was conducted by Sandy Hughes, who's actually somebody whose conversation we'll talk about today. It was an interview from the early 1990s. The men had recently been arrested in the city's gay quarter and subjected to really just gross racist and homophobic abuse by the police. With these materials in mind, this is principally an oral history project for two very basic reasons. First, I strongly believe that oral history can best clarify the connections between, these examples of disconnected images within the archive of Black Liverpool. And second, I've embraced oral testimony really as the kind of supremely useful in rendering these highly complex images of attraction, desire, and sociality, and also the ranges of signification, both categorizable and uncategorizable, that are central to my research aims. So I've approached this research with a view toward what I call recalibrating the barometer of insiderness. This is a sort of meta elaboration of oral historian Martin Meeker's process of interviewing across lines of sexuality, race, and gender and class. And I think that this approach speaks as much to the destabilizing of identifications woven into my theme as it does the potential of for example, non-queer testimony to productively redirect and reframe queer testimony. Okay, so far, I've had, for the Liverpool portion of my research, 15 conversations with unique participants. Today, I'm going to work with extremely condensed versions of about 8 of them. And as a content warning, the conversations do contain swear words and descriptions of drug use and sex. And also, not because I'm lazy, but because some of these conversations are a bit dense in places, I'm including the full text in the slides just for ease of access. Okay, so I'm going to get into it now. And our first is Sandy. Sandy, who is nearly 80 at the time of our interview, is Black, queer, lesbian identified woman. She was joined by Faith, age 58, a Black lesbian woman and Sandy's close friend for over 30 years. Sandy lives in Liverpool 8, where the area changes from Toxteth to either St. Michael's Hamlet or Egbert, depending on who you ask and what year you mean. To Sandy, it's still Liverpool 8, and every inch of her flat is covered in posters, flyers, reminders of the hundreds of protest shows, club nights, projects, and exhibitions that she's organized, featured in, or documented. She was born in Bristol during the war to a Black American GI and a white British civil servant mother, and she was immediately put into a children's home. She joined the army at age 17, and she later married a man and moved north to the Wirral, where they had 4 children. He was often at sea, and his returns home occasioned escalating physical abuse. So in the early 1970s, she ran to Liverpool to save herself. And by then, she'd been visiting a gay bar in the city center called the Lisbon for some time, and she got a job serving there. This was an introduction to gay nightlife that confirmed for her a sexuality she'd always been aware of, but never allowed herself to explore. Also, with her camera, she became a prolific documenter of that scene. In the years that followed, Sandy petitioned unsuccessfully for custody of her children. The father of her 3 girls and 1 boy leveled homophobic charges, which convinced the family court that Sandy could have the boy but not the girls. And not wanting to separate them, she opted to leave all 4 of them on the Wirral. After living in the city center near St. Luke's Church, off Hope Street, and in North Liverpool, Sandy finally moved to her Liverpool 8 flat in 1988. And it was around this time that she and Faith met, both being involved in activism around the repeal of Section 28. Sandy, at this point, had moved from photo to video after receiving a grant to train formally as a filmmaker and editor. Now, I wondered, after visiting Sandy Hughes' archive in the Liverpool Record Office and looking through its materials, at the absence of Sandy herself in most of the pictures. And second to that, I wondered at the near absence through the 70s and 80s of people of color, and more specifically, people I might identify as Black. Sandy has stated elsewhere that news images of the American race riots in the 1960s formed the sort of primary impulse for her practice, but racial politics only seemed to enter the frame of her work in a more pronounced way a decade after the 1981 uprising. Therefore, documents of her city center years feel relatively detached from Black Liverpool. And during our interview, she agrees that her documentary interest in Black Liverpool happened later after the white gaze. From the mid to late 1980s, Sandy's flats had been gathering points for many in her gay social milieu. This trend continued into the 1990s when her L8 flat became a sort of sanctuary for mostly white gay men. Whenever she visited Sandy, Faith would find her home full of them just hanging out. And I asked Sandy whether there was a sense for her in the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s of something like a queer community in LA. And she flatly says no, not in the 70s or 80s. Faith recalls that there were a few people, but remarks that for a district with a lot of Black people, Black gay people, certainly not. James was born in 1969 and grew up in Liverpool 8. His mother was an Irish-English Scouser. His father, a seaman, was born in Trinidad and moved to Liverpool in the late 50s. He is heterosexual, mixed Caribbean, and a Black British man. His mother had 2 full white children and his father 1 son before they met, and they had 4 additional children from that union. So theirs was a large, very blended family. When we meet, James begins declaratively his gay friends, he says, in Liverpool 8, who were largely Caribbean or Chinese, would surely have introduced him to any sort of gay scene in the district had it existed. He would have known about it. In the time of his early adulthood, in the late 80s and 1990s, he and his gay friends preferred the city center. The bars in Liverpool 8 were then, to his memory, quite testosterone. James went to an all-white elementary school in the white part of Liverpool 8, known locally as the Dingle. There were very few Black kids there, and also no Black faculty or staff, and it was horrendous. The abuses were near constant and racist in nature. His transition to a racially diverse senior school was a relief, though ironically there most of his friends were white. At age 15, he left Liverpool, going down to Oxford to live with one of his white sisters. When he moved back to Liverpool at 18, it was to this predominantly white social group from senior school that he'd maintained contact with, and also to a job in a predominantly white city center office. Once he traveled back to Liverpool 8 with two of these friends after a night drinking in town. They wanted to play pool at the popular Ebo Club. A group of young Black patrons who were outside at the time stopped him at the door and, looking at James' friends, told them that they weren't allowed in. After a brief confrontation, James ushered them into the club. Not long afterwards, a Black man who James had gone to school with approached him. He said to James, "What happened to you? You used to be one of the boys." James immediately answered, "I grew up." James preferred the city center. The fact that Blacks were still, in this time, denied entry to many clubs there, and that even if allowed entry, groups of white lads would direct racist language at Black patrons, this didn't dissuade him. If anything, being a tough guy of a certain age, a fight was often just a part of a good night out. His friends also introduced him to the city center's gay scene, where he really blossomed. Dancing topless and dripping sweat, he felt that he could finally let his guard down. At some point in the early 90s, he was even offered a job as a paid dancer. So there was James, practically nude on a podium. And it was fun for a while, but he soon grew tired of the poking and fondling. He was a very sexual person in those days, a complete tart, he says. His gay friends, the only ones with which he could talk more sensitively about sex and sexuality back then, they'd often say to him, "You're gay, you just don't know it." And he did occasionally wonder about his enjoyment of queer sociality and about that specific charge, the feeling of being desired by gay men. He says, "I like the sexual charge and I quite like being looked at or fancied, but," and he smiles and clarifies, "I know what got me hard, and it was women." The attention of women in the bars was certainly a draw too, and he admits quite complexly that the gay bar was such a sexually charged environment and space that it made it even more exciting for him. Ronnie is 67 years old when we meet. He is a white, heterosexual identified man. As teenagers living in the suburb of Walton in Liverpool, he and his friends came to understand L8 as the very definition of bohemian. They were bored to death of their suburban surroundings, and the district bristled with the promise of meeting people distinctly unlike themselves and their parents. "We thought, we can't get to Paris, but I reckon we can get to Liverpool 8, he says. By the early 1970s, he was working for a housing association in Falconer Square in Liverpool 8. He developed then a deeper understanding of the police brutality that plagued the area, young Black men being systematically rounded up and sent to juvenile detention centers. This coincided with a more thorough introduction to the social scene of Liverpool 8. He and his friends began frequenting the after-hours bars like the Somali Club, the Ebo Club, and many others. These were mostly juke joints, social clubs set up by earlier waves of African migration, which were now bars and clubs that catered to later Caribbean migrants and their Liverpool-born children. Some featured live music, while many, like the Somali, were front rooms in Georgian houses with a little jukebox in the corner playing disco and soul to mixed crowds. Though, Ronnie notes, the further into Liverpool 8 one went, the blacker the clubs got. The Somali club, like many, was always heaving. There wasn't any room, he said. There was nowhere to sit. These were his first experiences as a minority in social spaces, spaces marked by an interracial sociality unheard of in the city center. Whites dance with blacks, blacks dance with white. In the tight collectivity of these, there we go. In the tight collectivity of these room-sized clubs, Ronnie says, it just felt like we were all bohemians together. Occasionally, he would attend parties in the home of a particular friend, his first long-term Black friend, who we'll call Ted, who rented a room in Liverpool 8. Ted would often make food, and he had an excellent record collection, lots of Black albums, and friends who were obviously gay. Gathering in Ted's rooms occasioned the first same sexual intimacies that Ronnie had ever seen. I asked him somewhat ham-fistedly if he ever got the sense of bars and clubs as allowing, distinctly non-heterosexual forms of intimacy. And his thoughtful reply almost shames my clumsiness. Quote, I didn't. I think the whole thing was so thrilling and I was so pleased to be there that I hadn't. Also, on the whole, the places were so crowded, I wouldn't have known really who was dancing with who. Sometimes you didn't know who you were dancing with when you were dancing with them. I never thought there was anything in those spaces that wasn't okay. Anonymous, who we'll call A1 for convenience, is a white man in his 60s. He wears a wedding ring and is silent on the question of sexual identity or orientation. He was born into a middle-class family and raised in the area of West Derby, just over 4 miles from Liverpool 8. He recalls an all but exclusively white environment, save one Asian child in grade school and one black guy in senior school. He also remembers a 1960s Liverpool city centre full of black music and bereft of black people. He regularly saw signs reading "No Blacks Allowed." In the mid-1970s, then in his early 20s, he worked for council housing support services located within Liverpool 8. It was his local black and white colleagues who introduced him to the area's social clubs. They were the only places open near the office to get lunch or early dinner. Now, these were mixed social clubs and bars, but mostly Black Caribbean, he recalls. And by, he developed a local knowledge base that allowed him to more confidently explore the area's nightlife possibilities. And this led him to the hidden after-hours clubs. Like the Somali Club in the Igbo, these clubs opened late, long past licensing hours, but unlike the licensed pubs and juke joints, they were held illegally in garages and warehouses, catering to young seamen, Filipinos, Chinese, blacks, very few white people. During this time, one coworker, a white drug dealer who I'll call David, became his lover. And they and their group of 6 or so straight identified white male friends enjoyed free access to a range of bars and clubs, gay and straight, in both the city center and Liverpool 8. Their easy access, obviously enabled in part by David's drug dealing trade and his kickbacks to doormen. His relationship with David was not out, though at least one of their group was aware and once warning them at an after-hours club to not let their guard down in front of the other friends because it would be all over the office if they did. Though, he clarifies, the environment in this particular club couldn't have felt more liberating. Men danced with each other in interracial groups, and he speaks at length about the beat and the atmosphere. Everyone was sweating, he says. It was electrifying. He recalls one occasion in this particular club during which a friend in their party drew attention to 2 black men kissing openly. He told his friend to just be quiet and keep dancing, lest they get thrown out for saying something. Jimmy was born in 1954, making him 68 or 69 at the time of our conversation. He's half Irish, half Scottish, a white man of undisclosed sexual identity. He is from Liverpool 8. In the early 70s, when he was around L8, he was introduced to the black bars and clubs there. When he was around 18, He had no problem getting into these spaces. Of course, he'd have to be introduced to the bouncers and staff by a black person or another local white who was a known regular. Brought up Catholic, Jimmy's sexuality was formed through intense collisions of desire, repression, fear, confusion, and guilt, such that the idea of sex itself was terrifying, full stop. Still, to his recollection, like most people or teenagers in his peer group, he explored his sexuality with both girls and boys. Around 1977 or 1978, he lived for a time with a Jamaican family in L8. Now, there were 2 black clubs by then in the city center, Kirkland's, which stood on the ever-shifting boundary of L8 and the city center on Hardman Street, and the Timepiece. Jimmy and his friends, they regularly went to both. At Kirkland's, Jimmy's was introduced by a mutual friend to a local black man whose nickname was Diana Ross. And this was because he dressed as a woman. He and Diana hooked up once in Diana's L8 flat, but they were both tops, so it was only a fumble. An incident from 1981 has just occurred to him. He was in a place called the Silver Sands, which was a popular black club in Liverpool 8 located in a house. On the weekends, a large upstairs space would open. One Saturday, he was there with a straight black friend who had introduced him to Diana Ross, a white male friend of theirs, and that man's white girlfriend. Apart from them, the lounge, like the rest of the bar, was full of black people, predominantly tough guys, or what he calls hard cases. Later, a local black man arrived with a group of young white men. And then, one by one, every one of these tough guys coupled off with one of these young men and left. Jimmy still knows some of these men. He still sees them. They're married and they have families and they've stayed local. Though he never observed explicitly gay encounters in the LA bars he frequented, it was very clear to anyone looking, he says, that there were men there who liked banana. You could tell by the way they were looking at you, chatting to you, by their eye contact. Regarding his sexuality, Jimmy remarks, "Well, I used to flip between. Today, after having relationships and encounters with men and women of varying gender expression, he doesn't define his sexuality. It's not something he feels he needs to do." Joan is 56 at the time of our meeting. She is a gay white woman, and she was born in 1966 in New Brighton. She thinks back to the 1970s with nothing but horror. By the decade's end, her grandfather had died, her mother was mentally and physically disabled from a massive stroke, and her father battled to keep homelessness at bay. She remembers seeing unemployed men cry in the street. Her father cried at home. They survived, though. Much of this is owed to the community spirit and the informal economies that Liverpool 8 is infamous for, and which still provide the basis for the obnoxious stereotype of the robbing Scouser. She also remembers the 1980s as awful for the North. She recalls Liverpool as a city economically on its knees. She had to leave in the early 80s because there was simply no work, and she went to university in Newcastle and lived there for a while afterwards. But unable to find work there after studying, she returned to the Wirral briefly before moving to Liverpool in 1988 to work at the Everyman Theatre. When she first moved to the city, Joan told people she lived in Liverpool 8, which was and still is a political term. She lived in a small flat in St. Bride Street in what is known as Canning, technically an LA postcode area, but very much on its edge. Joan describes St. Bride Street as very much an L8 vibe. Her neighbors were from all over the world, all different cultures, lots and lots of queer people, lots of sex workers. Most of the residences on the street were old Georgian houses that had been turned into clusters of rooms, bedsits, small self-contained flats. Much of the accommodation was rented by sex workers, mainly cis women and probably some trans women and men, and they were a visible part of the area's street life. When I asked her about her queer neighbors then, with specific reference to any gay bars in Liverpool 8, Joan replies, "It doesn't need them, does it?" When asked if she ever went to any of the bars or clubs in Liverpool 8, she replies, "Not really, no. I was here at the end of the 1980s when things were... No, I didn't really." I wonder if she means closed or demolished. Maybe a lot of them were gone, I ask, but she's non-committal. In the late 80s and early 90s, to her recollection, it was more about house parties for her anyway, because L8 was, quote, where gay people lived. Anonymous 2, or A2, was born in 1950. He is a Black heterosexual man. His heritage is intergenerationally mixed, involving couplings of Caribbean, English, and Irish ancestry that are common to Black Liverpool. Black Liverpool for A2 is automatically distinct from settled Black communities elsewhere in Britain, which have what he calls an umbilical link towards Jamaica. Liverpool is different, he argues, because of its seafaring links with West Africa, and you can see this in some of the original names of the L8 nightclubs, the Yoruba Club, the Nigerian, the Igbo, the Sierra Leone, the Ghana Club, and so on. These clubs started as associations supporting their own local communities. Regarding the internal racial boundaries of Liverpool 8, those lines of division that regulated movement and residence beyond certain streets, A2 remarks, "They've always been there. Those boundaries have always been in place. The nightclubs," he continues, "were all about security. Those boundaries are about security." I'm slightly embarrassed to reorient our conversation to sexuality, but I do. And then I'm slightly surprised to hear him say, No, there was none of that. A black club is a recognized gay place? Whoa, you can't have that. It's a black thing. These clubs, he emphasizes, were before and apart from anything else, black spaces. He clarifies this by noting that simply that these spaces were never referred to as gay because there were already gay spaces in the city center. He says, it wasn't like you could say, if you want a gay club, go to the Ebo. It wasn't like that. He shrugs. If you wanted a gay club, you just went to a gay club. But of course, there were gay people living in Liverpool 8, and he says you could see them in the clubs. You knew who they were. You'd see them in the Nigerian, they'd be in the Sierra Leone. He is careful to reiterate, however, that no one would have thought of these spaces as gay or identified them as anything other than the black clubs they were. Jerry is a white homosexual man. He was born in 1962 in the Blackstock Gardens tenements in Liverpool city centre. He was raised there by a very large and extended community household. And Blackstock was, for the effeminate young Jerry, a remarkable entry into the world. He would not learn the transgression of his campness until the family moved to North Liverpool in 1970. Though it was only a mile away from Blackstock, life there from age 8 to 16 was, in his words, an onslaught of verbal and physical abuse. Creativity provided a lifeline for young Jerry. If it weren't for the Everyman Theater on the border of L8, which he found at 16, he would have been lost. And socially, in his teen years, he also relied on a countercultural network of spaces, including people's homes and bars and pubs in Liverpool 8. One space he remembers fondly is the Ebo Club, and he went there often, recalling, what a fantastic place with gays that was. As long as you didn't crassly dominate, you were fine. Occasionally, someone, a gay, would come in and crassly dominate, and the vibe was like, oh, fuck off. He clarifies, however, that anyone, including straight blokes, would be hissed at if they disrupted the vibe of the club. While he and his friends had all been told horror stories of Black Liverpool, Jerry found that living and socializing in the area mirrored the community comfort of his early childhood. He recalls, I never felt less alone. I never felt more welcome. In 1980, he met Sandy Hughes during one of his first visits to a gay club in the city center. A staggering beauty, he recalls, and she was to his memory already then a central figure in Liverpool's gay scene, this Black woman in the middle of all this whiteness. He was living in Percy Street then. It was one of the several flats he'd have in Liverpool 8. Of that time, he says, those pre-pandemic years, between 1979 and 1981, they were probably my 3 favorite years of life. It doesn't need gay bars, does it? I continue to take this statement very seriously because what is it to not need gay bars? And I'm also reminded of a quote by the writer Richard Bruce Nugent, who, when talking about open homosexuality during the Harlem Renaissance, said, people did what they wanted to do with whom they wanted to do it. You didn't get on the rooftops and shout. You just did what you wanted to do. So far, my conversations about Liverpool 8 have helped me to create a very crude constellatory map of the district from the late 60s to the late 90s. So first, there are, the gay artists, the theater boys, the university students living in the area, patronizing its bars, the local Black men and the quirky residents who were part of a shared quotidian environment, the sex workers, some men, some trans women, the explicitly queer and multisexual parties and gatherings and house parties, the same-sex embraces and kisses and after-hours clubs. Then there's another group or constellation, and these are the spaces and relations and encounters and erotics that are tricky to fix, those that are in the form of suggestion only, or those that emerge through a knowledge of local registers of feeling and relating, those that resist easy definition, the backroom introductions at the Silver Sands, the lingering glances between straight men in dance halls, the sort of sweaty, ecstatic dissolutions of gendered body in the dark and tight dance floors of clubs and shebeens, the vibes that were so seductive and electric that it hardly matters who was pressing up against you, the the heterosexual muscle boys erotically charged by being an object of queer desire. As a way to discuss these relations over time, as well as notions of visibility and legibility, I'd like to use Sandy as a point of entry. Sandy's oral testimony and her archive offer us an insight into common preoccupations in the 1970s and 1980s. Gay and lesbian identity and gay rights were her primary concerns. By the time she relocates to Liverpool late in the 1980s, her social ties in an all but exclusively white and largely male gay quarter are transplanted to a home gathering space that mirrors that makeup. When she and Faith are firm in there being nothing like a Black queer community in L8 in the 70s and 80s, it may very well be because her deeper residential and social connections to the city center and its queer visualities, these dematerialize the possibility of a queer L8. Now, instead of trying to prove Sandy wrong, I'd like to start from the position that she's actually right in a certain sense, and more broadly, that she couldn't have come to any other conclusion. Much like the remembrance and study of historical gay space, Sandy's political work, and indeed much of the work of, We're Here, We're Queer activism in the 1980s, it demanded a critical mass of visible and legible significations of gay life and identity. It's not so much that Sandy doesn't speak of queer social life in Liverpool 8, excuse me. What is important is that when she does, she speaks only of her flat and its out subjects from out social spaces. And while she and Faith are both adamant in the non-existence of any such thing as queer community in L8 and any functional value during the 70s and 80s, I argue that functional value here relates to a preoccupation, again, with the legible gay subject and space as politically viable phenomena. Sandy's lack of local and haptic knowledge of L8's social and sexual landscape, they produce results that are more or less aligned with historical interpretations and impressions of the district and others like it with no gay bars. While indeed, many of the forms of legible queer identity in space were absent or far less present in Black Liverpool than in the city center, without this haptic knowledge, she was initially unable to see the actual variety of sexualities and intimacies that still thrive there. Interestingly, this period of Sandy's relocation to L8 and her growing documentary concerns with Black identity, this coincides with James's return to the city in 1988. Now, I think that Sandy and James have something of a reverse intimacy process with the area. While Sandy's interest in racial injustices and tensions in L8 and the city at large grows, James's social disconnection from the area intensifies. What is common between them in this period is the social and affective reliance on the gay city center, but this common point diverges in impulse. The Black Liverpool to which James returns and Sandy moves in 1988, it's a local culture that is changed by the long 1980s of uneven and contradictory police reforms, of amplified spatial and economic isolation, of blighting, of the mass unemployment that disproportionately affected young Black men in Liverpool 8 during the era of Thatcher's managed decline. These internal boundaries, particularly for men, are now even firmer and even more unyielding. For James, the gay clubs were significant precisely because they offered him a space separate from what he experienced as limited social and affective possibilities in L8. A handful of years away, a new open association with white non-locals now mark him as an outsider upon his return, and the gay quarter becomes a space of freer expression. It also becomes the fulcrum of new erotic pathways to heterosexual pleasure. For James, being accepted and desired by gay men itself was arousing, a socio-erotic thrill that charged his straight liaisons at home in Liverpool 8 and elsewhere. The gay club for Sandy becomes first a place of sanctuary, then a valuable documentary tool, and later a site emblematic of the uneven progress of gay and anti-racist activisms in the city. It is only from L8 as a resident that she frames the arrest of 3 local Black gay men as totemic of racialized homophobia. I'd argue that Sandy's concern trajectory, including her deferral, her later after the white gaze, can be as impactfully read as Jones' comment. Moving to Black Liverpool marks the beginning of a shift. It's not necessarily that distinctions between Black and queer sociality collapse for Sandy. Rather, Black Liverpool seems to operate through her to effect a profound change in how she sees the world of race, sex, and gender and intersection. And so if there's no queer Liverpool late in the 70s and 80s for Sandy, and only after her arrival can there be the beginning of something like a queer L8, I'd argue that the possibility of the queer L8 in varying forms of legibility and signification erupts for her as a possibility just through the haptic knowledge that results from finally being local and finally understanding herself as local. Elsewhere is the example of James's complicated erotic positionality. I would argue that this transmutation of homoerotic desire and arousal to heterosexual charge unsettles the identificatory processes that generate histories of queer space. James's feelings are not homosexual. Rather, we might see them as an example of something more elusive, perhaps more fugitive, a superpositional erotics and translation that exist beside and around more straightforward and easily categorizable feelings. If we consider these situational, slippery, or paradoxical experiences of arousal, attraction, desire, and encounter as part of the psychic webbing of spaces that are never marked queer and never markable as queer retroactively, how can this bear on the way we sexually identify social spaces and socialities of the past? The example of Liverpool 8 can actually reveal a nexus of disciplinary concerns over the interpretations of feelings and definitions of encounters of the past, as well as the internal contradictions of queer historical recovery as it relates to these interpretations and definitions vis-a-vis social space. In fact, it could actually be that something like erotic theory or history, or something like desire studies may be a more fitting home for these narratives and their relationships to change over time. Dark matter is estimated to make up almost 85% of the total matter in the universe, roughly more than 5 times as much as all ordinary visible matter. If we apply this to intimate and relational energy and material and social space, we begin to think more openly about how feelings and bodies interact in far more interesting and frustrating ways than histories of queer space typically account for. To not need the gay bar, it's to take seriously the foreclosures of queer as it mimics and applies a mesh of legible scripts to the studies of where and how we lived, loved, partied, and desired. To not need the gay bar is hopefully to disorganize queer history and social history, to not only include, but to co-foundationally rely on sexual illegibilities and the eroto-strategically unspoken, that being the signs, signals, the symbols of not gay, but not gay vibes, modes, frequencies, and currencies of desire, feeling, space, and sociality. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity, Justin.
It was a delight to welcome you and a delight to hear your talk.
Thank you so much.
Remove the slideshow. We've got a smaller group joining us today, so I think it actually presents a really great opportunity to almost have like a more intimate seminar. So aside from thanking you for a really engaging talk and sharing the stories of your interview partners, which really were so engaging, and I can only imagine what the actual original testimony is like to go through. I want to encourage everybody who is watching. There is time for questions. Feel free to write them in the comments portion, where some applause and thank yous and whatnot are coming in now. Feel free to ask questions. I'm going to start with a couple myself, but we'll keep an eye on what's showing up to the side of the screen. First of all, I think it's really interesting to think about your work in the context of some of the really recent work, going on in the UK around queer localities and around the getting us decentering London as the focus of queer histories, which is so needed in this country. Of course, Matt Cook and Alison Orum's book, Queer Beyond London, the book that we co-edited together, Locating Queer Histories, that went beyond those 4 cities, or the 4 cities that they studied, Brighton, Leeds, Plymouth, and Manchester. It's so easy to imagine from what you're describing, Liverpool being one of those focal points that could have been studied in a project like that. Or had I known more about the work that you were already doing, I would have been pressuring you hard to contribute to the collection. So my question comes out of that. If you had to synthesize your work into this interest in the historical specificity of locality. How would you do that? What would you say about Liverpool or L8 as a significant locality and the impact of locality on these identities, categories, or non-categories, as it may be?
I would say that we, in terms of understanding a place like Liverpool 8 or the city that I compare it to in that broader PhD, in my broader project, which is Newark, New Jersey, the idea of different organizing factors as primary is something that is and should be very important to any kind of queer historical recovery that is based very much in site and location. Going back to the testimony of A2, which I think is one of the most striking, and there were other testimonies that I couldn't include just in the interest of saving time, they all come back to this very basic thing, which is there is a sort of like queer presence in the quotidian environment, but what is the significant organizing factor becomes different forms of race and racialization that create those localities and create a sort of impulse for everybody to work collaboratively to keep themselves and their spaces safe. I think once we move beyond the idea of queerness as a sort of like always universalizing sexual category or impulse and look at the ways in which other, perhaps even ontologically tricky or defined categories of identity remove even the impulse for that sexual organization to occur within spaces, we can have a more interesting conversation about how people sort of like relate to each other, how people use the erotic, how people understand sexuality through very specifically sort of like local codes and forms of knowledge, I think.
Well, you're making a good case for it in your research. I'm also wondering actually about the sources. Obviously, you've focused here on the oral history sources and the richness of those and the range of stories that they tell and experiences that they illuminate. I'm wondering about what other sources you use in collaboration with the oral histories, and I'm thinking especially of Sandy Hughes, but I mean, this applies to anyone. I realized as you were speaking, I met Sandy a number of years ago, and it was in your description. I'm like, this person seems very familiar, and I remember Sandy being a very compelling person at that time already, and the photography and the film and whatnot. I'm wondering to what extent you've had access or permission to use or have used these Sandy's artistic productions in combination with the testimony.
In combination with the testimony, only the things which have obviously sort of like been publicly released via her channel. I was allowed to see her archive, which was an amazing couple of days I spent just looking through her materials. And there's just this almost overpowering sort of like wealth of material, photographic, from the late 70s, even going back even a bit earlier than that, to when she sort of like moves in a more sort of like concrete way to video in the early 90s. So the permission agreements didn't allow for me to use the material in a way that I really would have wanted to. In my broader thesis, I do sort of like have versions of the notes that I made and versions of a story, a fuller story of Sandy into which her testimony fits, but is corroborated and at sometimes sort of like complexed by what we actually see in the archive. The importance of Sandy's archive to me, you know, apart from it being a testament to, I mean, her, I don't know if you've seen it or have seen any of the materials, but the wealth that is there indicates this sort of like this beautiful compulsion to document everything as you saw it, even things that we might ordinarily consider more atmospheric or not necessarily a document of history, but a document of a vibe or space. That's all there. But it sits at this point within this constellation of other sort of like images of Liverpool 8 that touches them and redirects them in a way that suggests something else. And so the importance of all of these images, including the contextual material, other things that I've seen in the archive, memoirs that I've studied, newspaper clippings that all seem to suggest something around a more complex way of viewing Black sociality within Black Liverpool without directly doing or saying anything. One of the contextual materials that I actually shared on the site was, it wasn't one that I encouraged people to look at, but it's actually an article from the Liverpool Guild Gazette, where they interview 3 confirmed homosexuals, I think the year is 1962, in Liverpool, about sort of like decrim and gay rights and, gay identity, full stop. And the last of the 3 is a guy called Alphonse. Alphonse, no racial identity is given. I would assume in 1962 that if he were Black, that would have been mentioned somewhere in the article. One could also like rely on testimonies of other people about Black people not being allowed to work or patronize bars in the city center. You could assume that he is white. And when he's talking about his objects of desire and his liaisons of choice, he mentions that he likes dark-skinned youths. And these dark-skinned youths would be primarily found within, the sort of boundaries of Black Liverpool. And so having this alongside other sort of things that more directly speak to queer presence and queer networks and queer communities within Liverpool 8, I found really helped to sort of like already create this kind of really big dynamic context to work in with the oral histories. So I don't know, in a certain sense, that might even be a little bit cheeky or lazy. Like, I've relied on connections that can already be made if one just sort of like looks beyond sort of like the direct evidence and the concrete words in the archive, and instead look at the picture or the landscape that they sort of speculatively create together, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a couple, well, more applause and praise from comments.
God.
And rightly so. I want to draw us, Keziah, well, thanks you and expresses interest, having grown up on the Liverpool gay scene, expresses sort of thanks and appreciation for these collective and divergent histories. I think if Keziah is who I think, Keziah is one of our MA Queer History students now. So,
oh, amazing.
A direct successor to you here at Goldsmiths. So thank you, Keziah, for the question. Keziah asks, how did you approach finding interviewees for the project and the perennial challenge for oral histories?
Again, being a little bit lazy, and also I for many people, I think PhD research is it's kind of an extensive, overblown, like navel gazing activity, isn't it? So the 2 sites that I choose to compare to one another are Newark, New Jersey, which is the city that I grew up near, and Liverpool, which is the city I moved to in 2006. And my interviewees, or the people I had encounters with, which is how I prefer to frame these conversations, are people that I know through different forms of professional networking, through sex work, through curatorial work, through promotion and sort of like party scenesters, and also just through like partying, through clubbing in the city. As anyone, I think, who is aware of Liverpool, particularly during a certain period, maybe sort of slightly before the capital of culture and maybe a few years after, it is very easy to become sort of like very embedded in certain scenes and to develop, deep and trusting connections within those scenes. And so I was lucky to have that as a sort of like route into doing this kind of research. Otherwise, I was outsider enough, but also local enough, I think, to be of interest as a researcher. As complicated as that statement is.
No, that's something we've talked about actually with students, that kind of that insider-outsider status. I mean, of course, insiderness means there's established trust that you can speak to people, that people will come forward. But the outsiderness, I mean, speaking as a North American myself, the outsiderness is useful to have people to want to explain and to give you more background and more explanation, even if it's some things you might already be aware of. It's good as an outsider just to keep listening.
Yeah.
Use that as a momentum building.
And also the process of, Liverpool is a very easy city to fall in love with, and I very much did shortly after moving there. And so, in addition to it just being sort of quite navel gazy, this was in some ways, after living for a few years, sort of like across the Atlantic and then doing research and living in Florence for a while, a way to sort of like reconnect emotionally to the city as I knew it and loved it when I first moved in my early 20s. So yeah, this is all very selfish. Like my research project, it's really so much about just exploring these registers that are unseen and sort of unconsidered, but that by and by became very clear to me and very clear in their sort of dynamic, disruptive capacity.
I want to go further with Keziah's question, actually, knowing that I've got at least one of my students in the,
Okay.
maybe more. I'm gonna be selfish now, and sort of continue this as like an extension of our seminars that we just. I think still with that, on the question of oral history, and that you relied upon your existing networks to draw together people to speak to.
Mm-hmm.
How did you navigate the ethical implications of working from your own network in this study? How did you navigate those ethical questions, and what ethical questions did you see?
I mean, given that my connections to some of the interviewees, and including one which I'm very clear about, Anonymous One, is an ex-client during the time when I was doing sex work in the city. I don't think that there's any clear and cut way to sort of like indicate in your work that there has been something, that there has been nothing which verges on the personal and transactional within oral history work. I mean, there's been a wealth of writing about this, like there like power dynamics and an element of the transactional, and also sort of like elements of pleasure are part and parcel of the researcher sort of like approaching and extracting information from people. And oral history work is, and for me, in a certain sense, no different from or within the same sort of like realm of the normal sort of like modes of relation to one another that we engage in, with hopefully a mutual interest in keeping each other safe and in exposing something of ourselves that can be productively common, but also perhaps difficult to discuss. And so I don't know, like in a certain way, it's a very interesting question. In another way, because for me, my methodology, the previous relationships that I had with these people was not necessarily a complication. If anything, given the sort of the importance of localness to people in Liverpool, which is a city, you know, very maligned, a city that has itself within sort of like the national body of England or Britain suffered the forces of racialization over the years. Like it's a city that considers itself, if I can be broad in this sort of like sweep, very much not Britain. Being local engendered a kind of, or being somewhat local, a kind of closeness that I did not consider engaged in any sort of like ethical fisticuffs. Like it was helpful for me, like closeness in that sense did something to make the barrier between researcher and subject less tricky to sort of negotiate. I don't know if that goes sort of like a full way towards answering the question. I think it, like, you know, and also you have all of these very practical sort of like things, these ethical sort of like guideposts. You do everything you can to sort of, this is probably a more practical answer to the question that you were asking, excuse me, to make sure that people know exactly what the research is, exactly how it's going to be used, that they don't have to answer any questions if they feel uncomfortable, that this is a space in which they hopefully can feel comfortable to share whatever they want if they feel at any point that they're being pushed too far, or that they're that something is too triggering or complicated, they can stop it at any time. I'm also a human being, and in addition to being a researcher, and this is all language built into sort of like the handouts that come along with this research. If I notice that something is going into an area that feels too sensitive or dangerous, I can also make these things stop. So in addition to sort of like harnessing is sounds like such a clinical and disgusting word. Like, I am local. I love this city. I love my networks and friendships there. So being able to work through that, but also having this sort of like very clear document of guideposts came together to, I hope, make for an ethical sort of like engagement framework. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's no problem.
Like,
and I mean, of course, it brings up lots of things to ruminate on. It's not, of course, that there is, aside from the standards of research ethics, of informed consent, of mutual respect. I mean, a lot of it, there isn't a right answer for how to engage with a lot of these things. And so many of us, of course, do engage with our own communities and do engage with existing networks in the initial stages of oral history research. It's just that we're not always as transparent about it as you are. So that's I think maybe a critical comment toward oral history research in other instances sometimes. But as we wind up, do you have any other? Is there any final comments you'd like to share to start wrapping things up?
I am, at a point where I am sort of starting to actually having to work with these in a more concrete way. And so all of the bits of analysis that I've done in my head and have placed on pages in, dozens of notebooks have yet to find their way to my computer. And so I'm still looking for feedback. So if there's anyone who is watching today who would like to get in touch to talk about some of these things a little bit more, or to tell me that what I'm doing is crap, or to tell me that there's a certain element in what I've presented today that needs a little bit more focus or honing, then I'm super open to that. I mean, I'm still a student at this point. I'm still trying to figure out how I make this into, the thing, the product, the object that I hope it can be. So yeah, that's what I'd like to. My wrapping up statement is help me.
True words were never spoken by a Well, thanks so much for sharing your research with us, sharing these stories, sharing your work. I can't express to you how much I appreciate it and how delighted I am to have you in our space, even virtually, and before too long, hopefully physically as well.
Yeah. Very much looking forward to that.
Absolutely. So everyone on that's with us, please join me in thanking Khalil West for his talk today and for launching the Queer History PhD Network. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody who attended and heard me waffle on. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.